What would you do if you were in Ibrahim Traoré's shoes? He pulled over to help a roadside mechanic, only to discover it wasn't just any mechanic. This man was once one of his closest friends. What happened next shocked everyone around them. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. The midday sun was relentless, baking the asphalt beneath Ibrahim Traoré's car as it traveled down a narrow, dusty road just outside Ouagadougou. His convoy moved steadily, a few military vehicles trailing behind his own, the hum of engines mixing with the faint sounds of life from the roadside. Though he rarely strayed from official duties, today he had insisted on taking this particular route. This was a part of Burkina Faso, where life was defined by resilience, streets lined with small vendors, tires piled along sidewalks, and weary men wiping grease from their hands as they worked on aging vehicles. It was then that something caught his attention. Traoré's eyes locked onto a man crouched beside a battered sedan, his hands struggling with a rusted tire iron. The mechanic's clothes were faded, marked with oil stains from countless hours of grueling labor. Something about the man struck a chord with him. Though he couldn't quite place it at first, he tapped on the window, signaling for his driver to slow down. As the car eased to a stop, Traoré's gaze didn't waver. His bodyguard stood by, puzzled but silent, as Traoré stepped out onto the gravel shoulder and began walking toward the man. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like an ordinary act of kindness. The nation's leader stopping to offer his help, bridging the gap between power and the people. But for Traoré, there was something more. He squinted under the sun as he approached, unsure why the sight of this man left his mind racing. The mechanic was deeply focused, working in silence, his movements brisk but strained. As Traoré took a few steps closer, the man's face briefly tilted upward. The moment their eyes met, a flicker of recognition stirred in Traoré's chest. Something about that face, its shape, its expression, was hauntingly familiar. But the years had weathered it. He met people every day, shook countless hands as a soldier, and later as a leader. But this face, it came from somewhere deeper, somewhere personal. Traoré paused mid-step. His mind jumped to flashes of a different time. A younger version of this face, laughing, talking, dreaming. Could it be? He remained still, his thoughts turning chaotic. He thought of his own journey, rising from humble beginnings to his current position. He thought of the decisions he had been forced to make, the hardships his country faced, and how much of his life felt unrecognizable compared to where he had come from. And now, here was this man, bending over a broken car on the side of the road. For a moment, the juxtaposition of their two lives was almost too much to absorb. Inching closer, he studied the mechanic carefully, his brow furrowed in disbelief. The man stood up, wiping his hands on an old rag, but didn't look toward Traoré again. Not yet. Traoré could see the deep lines etched into his face, lines carved by years of labor and survival. Something about the man's posture, his way of standing there, tired but upright, brought the past rushing back. Then, like a dam breaking, the realization hit him. This man wasn't just anyone. He was a friend, a part of Traore's life from years ago, before politics, before power, before everything changed. A sharp breath escaped Traore as his eyes widened. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if movement would shatter the fragile moment. His reaction was unguarded, and his bodyguard shifted slightly, unsure of what to make of his expression. Here stood one of the most powerful figures in the country, unable to speak as memories cascaded through him. The mechanic hadn't seemed to recognize him yet, his mind too consumed by his work, but Traore's shock was evident. Snapping himself out of it, he closed the gap and spoke his friend's name, barely above a whisper. The mechanic hesitated before looking up again, and then, in an instant, realization dawned across his face too. What followed were the few seconds of silence that carried years' worth of emotions, a moment where two paths, once intertwined, crossed again in the most unexpected way. Whatever happened next would be shaped by this overwhelming moment of recognition. How did two boys with the same dreams end up worlds apart? That's the question that must have played on Ibrahim Traoré's mind as he stood face to face with his old friend, Thomas. Years ago, long before titles or uniforms, Traoré and Thomas were inseparable, growing up together in a small village where every path seemed to lead to the same horizon. They weren't just friends, they were practically brothers. They ran through dusty fields, shared meals, and whispered about the men they wanted to become. Life felt so simple then, and the future felt like something they could shape with their own hands. But even in their youth, things weren't always fair. Thomas lost his parents when he was just a boy. It was a tragedy that changed everything for him. With no one to look after him and his younger sister, he dropped out of school and quickly started doing odd jobs around the village. That's how he learned his trade, working under an older mechanic who passed down everything he knew. While other kids were starting school days with lessons and lunches, Thomas was tightening bolts and fixing cartwheels just to scrape by. Yet despite the challenges, he still managed to hold on to his childhood bond with Traoré. Together, they dreamed big. Traoré was full of ideas, of hope even. Thomas once joked he thought his friend would grow up to be the village teacher, but Traoré had a much grander vision for himself. He used to say things like, "You promised me we would change this country together." They'd sit under the mango trees, deep in conversation about justice, fairness, and how they could someday make life better for everyone around them. The nights were long, their laughter loud, and their plans endless. And then there was the infamous Mango Farm incident, the kind of memory that still feels vivid no matter how much time has passed. Traoré couldn't help but laugh as he stood on that roadside, remembering Thomas's wide-eyed panic that day, when they were caught stealing mangoes from old man Kiboli's farm. It was a simpler time when their biggest worry was running away fast enough to avoid a scolding. Looking back now, it seemed like a different lifetime. But as they grew older, life began to split their paths in ways neither of them could control. Traoré excelled in school, moving on to opportunities that would eventually lead him to join the military and, later, into leadership. Each step he climbed brought him further from the village. Meanwhile, Thomas stayed behind. His life revolved around his workshop, struggling to keep it running as economic hardships mounted. He moved to the city for better prospects, But life in the city was no easier than the village. He spent years trying to make ends meet. Customers were few, the work harder than ever. The weight of responsibility hung on him like an anchor. Somewhere along the way, between fixing old engines and caring for his sister, the calls and letters between the two friends stopped. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. Life just happened. Now, standing here before Thomas, everything about their friendship seemed to hit Traore at once. The joy, the struggles, the plans they had for a future that had completely unraveled. How had their paths turned out so differently? Traore couldn't ignore the guilt creeping into his chest. He had risen to the highest position in the country, while his best friend, the boy who had shared his dreams, was stuck in this endless cycle of labor and survival. Still, there was one thing left, their connection. That hadn't disappeared, no matter how much time had passed. This encounter was more than just unexpected. It was a reminder. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but people who truly matter, stay with you, even when everything else changes. And as Traore stood there, the weight of his friend's struggles pressed on him. Knowing there was something he could do, he decided the story couldn't end like this. "How did I let this happen to you?" Those were the first words Ibrahim Traoré said as he stood face to face with Thomas, his old friend from years past. His voice was low but heavy, almost as if the weight of their shared history poured into each syllable. For a moment, the world around them, the bustling roadside, the distant traffic, seemed to fade. Thomas, stunned at first, took a step back, his hands still clutching the oil-stained rag he'd been using. Recognition dawned slowly. Then, with a small, almost shy smile, he looked Traoré in the eye and said simply, "Life just took us on different paths." It was a moment thick with emotion, and neither man seemed to know quite what to say next. Traoré immediately removed his military cap, the gold insignias gleaming under the sun, and reached out to pull Thomas into an embrace. His security team watched with uneasy expressions, unsure how to react to their president breaking all protocol. But Traoré didn't care. He held his friend tightly, his eyes glossed with tears. This man, standing in oil-streaked overalls, had once shared his childhood, his laughter, his aspirations. And now, here they were, on opposite sides of life's chasm. They sat together on an overturned crate in the corner of the workshop. The heat of the day pressed down on them as they began to talk. Their voices were quiet, but the emotions in their conversation said everything. Traoré asked about Thomas's life, what had happened, how he ended up here. Thomas answered honestly, without self-pity. He described the years spent trying to make ends meet, the long hours at the workshop, and the fierce pride he took in raising his daughter, Amina, on his own. "She's my everything now," he said, his face lighting up for the first time. But even as he spoke of his daughter with pride, there was no denying the hardships etched into his voice. Thomas, still reeling from the unexpected encounter, couldn't stop glancing at Traoré, as if trying to reconcile the boy he'd grown up with and the man sitting before him. "You've done well for yourself, Ibrahim," he said quietly, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his tone. Traoré looked down, suddenly uncomfortable. It wasn't just the contrast in their lives that unsettled him. It was the feeling that Somehow he had left behind someone who mattered. He wrestled with that thought as Thomas continued to speak. At one point, their conversation paused, both men lost in their own reflections. Onlookers gathered curiously nearby, murmuring to one another as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. The president of Burkina Faso, dressed in full military uniform, sitting humbly in a greasy workshop with an old friend. But Traore seemed unaware of the stares. His focus remained entirely on Thomas. It was clear that this encounter wasn't something Traore could walk away from without acting. Yet the question of what to do wasn't simple. As a leader, there were expectations placed upon him, appearances to maintain, priorities to juggle. How could he show care for his friend without coming across as out of touch or insincere? It wasn't just about charity. It was about dignity, about ensuring Thomas's abilities and worth weren't overshadowed by his struggles. In the end, Traore made a decision that reflected not just his friendship with Thomas, but his values as a leader. He announced, right there in the workshop, that the roadside garage would no longer be just a place to scrape by. Instead, it would become a government-sponsored training center, where Thomas could pass on his skills to young people in the community. He added that Thomas's daughter, Amina, would be receiving a full scholarship for her education, and that the family would receive a new home. Thomas stared at him, unable to speak at first. When he finally managed to thank him, his voice cracked with raw emotion. The announcement overwhelmed everyone present, and for a moment, the workshop felt like the center of something much bigger. This wasn't just about repairing a friendship, or even repairing a life. It was about showing what kind of person Traore was. A leader who hadn't forgotten where he came from, or the people who helped shape him. In the end, this encounter wasn't just about two friends reuniting. It was a reminder of how unpredictable life can be, and how human connection shapes us. Ibrahim Traoré didn't see Thomas as just a mechanic or a symbol of past struggles. He saw him as a friend whose worth hadn't diminished despite life's hardships. His actions reflect a leadership rooted in empathy over power, justice over status. As Traoré said, "Some presidents are protected by guards, guns, and gates. But me, I'm protected by a friend." How would you respond if faced with such a moment of connection and responsibility?